Welcome to the LEWAS 2022 workshop, The New Economy, a Wolf in Sheep's Clothing. I'm Denise Mannix, President of Lean in Network Energy, or LEAN as we're more commonly known these days, and EVP of Equity and Leadership. I'm very proud to be leading the first of a series of events that headlines the partnership of LEWAS and Lean. Welcome to those of you who are literally joining us from time zones and locations all over the world. It's pretty amazing. If you'd like to let us know where you are joining us from in the chat, we'd enjoy knowing. So good evening to those of you in the Middle East and Europe. Good morning to those in North America. And if you're joining us from anywhere else in the world, like Australia or Asia, it's the early hours of the morning. So we are truly global. We have a few housekeeping comments to get through, with the first being our welcome. And we need to acknowledge and thank our sponsors, Aramco, who are our platinum sponsor, and BASF, our silver sponsor. We need you to know that you make this possible, and this is really important work. We'd also like to acknowledge with our sponsors and thank with our sponsors our supporting organisations shown here. Their support, your support, provides opportunities for our work and messages to extend into areas that might otherwise be closed to this important work. Let's have a look at some more items relating to the housekeeping of this session, and then we'll really get into it. Due to audience size, our interactivity will take place via the chat, where you can ask questions, make comments, and where our polls will be conducted. We have a production team that has oversight of the chat and the polls, and importantly, Linda Ibrahim, the VP of Lean in Network Energy, will be participating in the workshop, offering us your comments or questions and poll results. So when you see Linda appear on the screen, you know that your comments and questions and response for the polls are being offered into the discussion. And we'll really endeavour to get as many as possible into the next hour and a half. And despite the wonder of technology, we all know that technology issues can and do arise. And in the event that there are issues, our production team will provide support and information to you regarding the resolution of these issues. Finally, I'd also like to recognise Professor Christine Williams, whose research and book, Gaslighted, and some of you may have read this, and if you haven't, I suggest you do, is the inspiration for many of the ideas presented here. In Lean's monthly Coffee Connection event this year, we had an opportunity with permission to use Professor Williams' book for discussion. We watched her energy symposium and then discussed with her directly her work on women in energy in a fireside chat. We are really well supported with research, and it's important to know that this is very professional, very knowledgeable about an important issue within the energy industry. I'd like to now touch on LEWAS and Lean. In my welcome, this workshop represents the first of a new partnership between LEWAS and Lean. We carry a shared mission, as you can see on the screen, for empowering women in the energy sector. As president of Lean, I was truly humbled when LEWAS approached us about this wonderful opportunity of working together, and it's been an absolute delight so far. One of the segments in today's session is about networking, and I'd like to let you know that at the end of the workshop, the event will remain open for an extra 15 minutes for virtual networking. So if you can, please do stay around and network, because in the words of LEWAS, it offers infinite possibilities to our energy future. I'd also commend to you my value of one principle. Too often in these sessions, we try to get too much out of them and end up with not enough or too little. And I encourage you to look out for one thing you can use, just one thing that will add value to something you are doing, or that challenges your thinking or changes your thinking. Towards the end, we will be asking you to identify this value of one in the chat to ensure you walk away from this session having it made a difference to you. So it doesn't have to be, tremendously large or big or anything else. It's just about something that has true meaning to you, because you never know where a woman is in her career, where she is in the energy sector, or wanting to enter into the energy sector. So it's really important to take from the information provided today what you can to make a difference. So let's get on our journey in this workshop as we look at this video. It represents the subtitle of this session, A Wolf in Sheep's Clothing.
A wolf found it very difficult to get at the sheep because of the vigilance of the shepherd and his dogs. But one day he found the skin of a sheep that had been flayed and thrown aside. So he put it on over his own pelt and strolled down among the sheep. The lamb of the sheep, whose skin the wolf was wearing, began to follow the wolf in sheep's clothing. The wolf led the little lamb away and made a meal of her. For some time he succeeded in deceiving the sheep and enjoying hearty meals. Moral: appearances are deceptive.
So, the deliberate use of the topic subheading, A Wolf in Sheep's Clothing, is absolutely obvious. Appearances are deceptive. But I think the sentence that really stands out to me most is, he made a meal of her. And I certainly hope it wasn't too graphic for people. I tried to keep it as light as possible, given the subject matter. And this, he made a meal of her, is something that really stood out to me, especially when I was selecting this for this presentation. I believe that since at least the 80s, diversity efforts have made a meal of women, a meal of gender issues. That's a pretty harsh comment, but I think it's true. I believe diversity has been commoditized. We very rarely talk about difference anymore. And when we do, it's usually to do with a deficit. It's about bias, etc. And it tends to be focused on promises and opportunities rather than real outcomes. And so in post-pandemic era, there really is no time for complacency. Many of these words appearing in the graphic are well known to many of us. Words like the Great Resignation, for example, also known by other names as described by Forbes, like Great Reprioritization, Great Reshuffle, Great Recognition, Great Realization, Great Questioning, Great Change-up. Everything is about being great, because so much of what's going on is, apart from resignation, is really monumental. It's been a long time since this type of change has been impacted in the world. What about if we also look at female educational advantage? Some people may not really recognize that as a phrase that we commonly use. But it goes back to, many years ago, probably in the 80s and 90s as well, when women were told that if we increased our educational attainment, we will achieve, and we're promised that we'll get better jobs, better pay, and better opportunity. So studies now show women are now better in terms of being educated than men. Yet the needle for women in terms of the workplace, leadership in the workplace, career opportunities beyond middle management has barely moved. So no time for complacency, I thought, was a really interesting way of looking at it. And it's the title of a July blog from the Women's Foundation, who are based out of Hong Kong. And it makes 3 key statements, which is really, which are really important. Firstly, the world is still more than a century away from achieving gender parity. Excuse me. A century away is a long time. Some studies show 30 years. Others show, depending on cultures, for example, I read one which said that in Pakistan it was at least 300 years away. And we know from our efforts that these things take time. And I wonder, do we really have the time? So with a small increase in female representation in leadership positions and a notable decrease in women's workforce participation, we have also a higher percentage of wage inequality. And that is actually taken from the World Economic Forum 2022 Global Gender Gap Study. The second point that's made in the article or the July blog is that women are overwhelmingly burned out and feel excluded at work, according to Deloitte's Women at Work 2022 report. So both reports are really recent. 1 out of 3 women say employers offer flexible working, and an overwhelming 94% feel promotion prospects will be negatively impacted by requesting flexible work. So only 1 out of 3 are offering flexible working. An overwhelming 94% don't want to request flexible work, even though that's the talk of the day with hybrid work options, etc. And because of these very important movements towards these hybrid work environments, women are also reporting that they feel excluded at work for those who are actually working in these hybrid work environments. And the third point that is raised in the blog is that the pandemic has widened and deepened the poverty learning gap. And therefore, this current generation who have experienced the pandemic, etc., might lose $21 trillion in lifetime earnings, according to the State of Global Learning Poverty report. And women will be a large part of that working generation. So when we see these three studies, we start to see that women really aren't achieving the benefits that the change in that the pandemic has actually brought us. But before we dig deep, let's continue to see what we really do think or know or understand by starting with our poll. So it's an introduction to the session, and we'd really appreciate if you'd put your responses into the poll. And the question is, do you know what the new economy or the fourth industrial revolution or what either promotes as benefits for women in the 21st century workplace, in the energy sector or otherwise? So just to answer briefly, you may have already done it by the time I finish speaking. Yes, no, or unsure. In the chat, you don't need to make any comment unless you'd really like us to think about something that we can include later on. We will hear, with the support of our production team and from our VP, Linda Ibrahim, shortly as to what your responses are and look at what that discussion brings. Meanwhile, we will continue. So let's just set the scene. Let's understand what our baseline is so we can accurately assess whether the new economy or the fourth industrial revolution is making promises for women about gender neutrality. While this graph is in relation to oil and gas and paints a clear picture as to how this industry arena within the industry, the energy sector, sees women, not only is the percentage of women working in oil and gas low relative to other studies, and you can see the round circle and it says oil and gas there, and some of you may have seen this because it does come from the leaning.org and McKinsey report in 2018. when we look at dates and things, we're now always looking at that date in time of 2020, and we know how adversely affected women were through the pandemic. So we know we're looking for all the measures that identify this. So, excuse me. Not only is the percentage of women working in oil and gas low relative to other industries, the overall story is actually not good for women. So if we look at the total graph in the top right-hand corner where the square is, it shows that C-suite women are only at less than 40% across all industry sectors. I actually find that surprisingly high, but still, what it does show is that the needle wasn't moving before the pandemic, and the pandemic adversely affected women, as I've already said. So we shouldn't be talking about catching up to where we were, because that just wasn't good enough. It's important to note, and it's mentioned later in the session, that renewable energy shows improved outcomes for women in percentages, and we'll get to that, for employment and also for leadership, according to a Catalyst report. But even then, it is not as significant as it needs to be. So let's use this as our baseline, and we're going to move shortly into a brief storyboard of the changing emerging trends over the last 30 years or so. But before we do that, there's Linda, and she's going to share some information with us. Is that correct?
Yes, Denise. Hello, everyone. I am very glad that everyone decided to join us today, whether it be your day, night, etc. I was looking from the participants list of all of the different locations that we have, and it's truly a global representation as far as participants go. Just about every continent. I believe the only continent that we might be missing is South America. So hopefully somebody will join soon. I wanted to go over the poll results from our first poll, and overwhelmingly the results show that most of the participants are unsure, or they do not know the benefits that this new economy and the fourth industrial revolution is going to bring to women. So Denise, maybe you can educate us a little bit as to what you believe could possibly be the benefits, and more importantly, not what could be, but perhaps some of the things that we can be doing to make sure that we do benefit from these new the new environment that we're facing.
Thanks, Linda. Absolutely. The really critical issue when we're talking about this is per the heading of the session, which is a wolf in sheep's clothing, is when there are purported, that's an interesting word for me to be using, changes that are supposed to be beneficial. We have to look at these and see what is under the sheep's, the wolf's clothing, and really identify what does it truly mean for women. So what I'd like to do now is to help everyone to understand what this new economy looks like, where it came from, what the fourth industrial revolution, because there are mixed messages and there's no singular definition, and it really it confuses people, because as you'll see, it talks about the new economy and the fourth industrial revolution across a period of time, and all of these things, all of the things that are appearing are really quite different, but all occurring within a time frame. So the discussion initially occurs about the new economy between the late 90s and the early 2000s as the positive benefits of a prolonged period of economic change takes place. And if we think back, perhaps if you're old enough to think back to where you might have been during the 90s and early 2000s, you'll probably remember some of the things that were occurring with technology, and where we had things like global expansion and flexible networks. And we talked about the meaningful nature of work and enhanced personal quality of life. And also the productivity impact of the computer. And it was a revolution. And I always remember back in the 90s, my husband coming home from work one day, and we had a small business at the time, and he brought back these packages, and I said, "Well, what are those?" And I literally had my second child, and he said, "Oh, it's a computer." And I said, "Well, what are we going to do with it?" And he said, "Oh, well, you'll be able to set it up because you're smart." Anyway, those were the days of DOS, and I read the manual and I set it up. So even my I started to appreciate how that computer impacted our lives even at that early stage, and we've moved a long way since then. And then there's also dramatic levels of technological development in that time frame. And then as we move through to the 2020s, studies of social scientists about the workplace and labour market started to occur, with focus on the upward swing in potential output levels of productivity. There's major technical innovations, new forms of knowledge production, many of the things that we take for granted, or perhaps we've moved beyond in the 2020s, and changing communications technology. So we remember all the different styles of phone. I remember carting around in the 90s anyway, something that looked like a cement brick, or as they say here in the States, cement brick. That was actually the phone, and we had to always stand close to the outdoor windows of the building, because once we went further into a building, people couldn't hear us. So, communications were changing rapidly. So let's have a brief look at how this new economy was described in this short video. Now, you'll hear the words fourth industrial revolution mentioned frequently in this video, but it is an actual excerpt from a new economy video. And from this, you can see how the new economy, the world of the new economy and the fourth industrial revolution have somewhat been combined.
Now the fourth industrial revolution, 4IR. Fourth industrial revolution is building on the third, the digital revolution that has been occurring since the middle of the last century. It is characterized by a fusion of technologies that is blurring the lines between the physical, digital, and biological spheres. There are three reasons why today's transformations represent not merely a prolongation of the third industrial revolution but rather the arrival of a fourth and distinct one: velocity, scope, and systems impact. The speed of current breakthroughs has no historical precedent. When compared with previous industrial revolutions, the fourth is evolving at an exponential rather than a linear pace. Moreover, it is disrupting almost every industry in every country. And the breadth and depth of these changes herald the transformation of entire systems of production, management, and governance. The fourth industrial revolution, 4IR, characterized by the fusion of the digital, biological, and physical worlds, as well as the growing utilization of new technologies such as artificial intelligence, cloud computing, robotics, 3D printing, the Internet of Things, and advanced wireless technologies, among others, has ushered in a new era of economic disruption. The fourth industrial revolution, finally, will change not only what we do but also who we are. It will affect our identity and all the issues associated with it: our sense of privacy, our notions of ownership, our consumption patterns, the time we devote to work and leisure, and how we develop our careers, cultivate our skills, meet people, and nurture relationships.
So when we have a look at that video, one of the things that intrigues me is that you can see that we, even in the words that are mentioned, the issues that are presented, we are traveling through time at a very rapid pace, because even some of those things, while they're still current, are actually old by many years. So as the pace of change continues, we experience the redefining of capitalism and the global economy, the rise of networked relationships between organizations and flexible workplace practices, and the dynamic transformation of workplace relations, which in turn affect relationships within family and household relationships. And that's pretty powerful stuff when you think about it. So as we start to discuss more and more, the fourth industrial revolution seems to gain more traction out of the new economy. And then I still have to question, is it vice versa? The studies and the information that it can be quite confusing and, as I said, mixed. So let's see what the impact of this view becomes of the rapid change as it morphs in this next brief video. So in that video, you can see, this change that it's occurring more rapidly. You can understand that, some of the wording has also changed. We still have some of the older wording, but we also have some of the newer wording. And what's important, there was a piece in there which really identified the impact that it has on people, on our identities. And if we're not moving the needle on women, if we're keeping it at such a rate of change, which for us is slower than for everything else, we really have to do something about it. We really have to, whether it's make noise, make ourselves more knowledgeable, etc. We really have to do more, because the world isn't going to wait for us. And there's no use for us to hang on its coattails. We need to make a difference, and we need to make a difference to how we're perceived and how the realities of life really look for us. So then the 2020 global pandemic hits, and literally overnight, every organisation and industry sector has to rethink how it operates, has to revise its organisational logic. Companies and leaders that would not consider hybrid work options previously are forced to immediately have their workers operate remotely, without planning or strategy or even risk management in many cases. In fact, this is still a critical issue. And next week, I'm on a panel discussing hybrid work issues. And this morning, I was moderating for a conference that's occurring in September, and we had a panel. And one of the questions that they spoke about was in reference to DEI, was the impact of hybrid work, and so it's really interesting that this is central to us. It's central to how we think, how we work, how we play. And if women aren't going to get a piece of this puzzle, we need to ask the question, why? So understanding what the opportunities are in the new economy or the fourth industrial revolution, and to see if they're real, is really about digging our way through the mixed messages of this time period. And it's interesting because they're often written about in inverted commas. So often depending on which agenda you're driving or the lens you're looking through, or which speak to possibilities rather than realities, some consider this discussion old hat. But what we are talking about today is definitely not old hat. I'd like to suggest we are living in a period of the post-pandemic new economy, or as I like to say, the era of the great inverted commas. Think back to that earlier slide where we had all the different items relating to it not being a time for complacency, and everything is inverted commas. Everything is great. So if we think back and understand how change has occurred, it's become a truly disruptive change, a change which is discontinuous and non-linear, whether people related or technology related. So given that our careers, women's careers, are often considered non-linear, we really need to I think about how we move forward with this discontinuous change. So I spoke before about the new organizational logic. And I really like this word because it represents to me what it means to explain how organizations have to change and what it is they're changing. And that is that it identifies this new organizational logic, the way that organizations operate. There are 4 principles that negatively impact women in energy, despite promises of the opposite. And this is the wolf in sheep's clothing, and that I'd like you to think about as I've thought about it. What the shifting labour and workplace practices might suggest about opportunities for women. And note, we are still speaking to opportunities rather than outcomes. So if we look here, we can see that, as was advertised in this session promotional material, we're going to look at job precariousness, the rise of interdisciplinary teams, the rise of greater project management, etc., and teamwork, and how those teams are led and how they're led remotely, etc. Career maps and ideals. It actually is I-deals. So, and I'll talk about that when we get to that section. And then there's networking, which we hear about all the time. So when we look at these 4 pieces, these 4 principles, items 2, 3, and 4 are really key elements as well. That's not to say that job precariousness isn't important, but we can kind of talk about them in a separate way to make sense. And I mentioned earlier on in the introduction that we were talking about Christine Williams, Professor Christine Williams of the University of Texas at Austin, who is a sociologist. And to put this in perspective, we need to look at her words. It's about this new economy, this fourth industrial revolution, that gives us offerings such as these 4 pieces here that appear gender neutral on the surface, are more flexible than older systems of standardized career ladders and job descriptions, and are more compatible with women's non-linear career trajectories. So it would appear on the surface that these things are really going to be profitable for women. And so that's what we need to think about, and that's what we're going to discuss today. So let's now turn to one of the last powerful messages of the last video. This is taken from the World Economic Forum video that we just viewed. And it points to how do we avoid the world of joblessness, low productivity, and inequality. We know that the forum is speaking here to larger sectors and different populations than women in energy, but that this sentiment can be applied to women in the energy industry is unmistakable. If in this post-pandemic world, the wolf is indeed dressed in sheep's clothing, then this period in our history for women is really critical and really urgent. And it's really spurred me on to do something about it in many aspects of my life. We must listen with acuity and raise our voices through knowledge and speak with intelligence. So let's start by looking at job precariousness. So here we have the start of the discussion. And what I'd like you to do as part of the second poll is if you're a woman and you've been troubled by job precarity or job precariousness, in other words, you've been worried about your job, whether getting a job, whether keeping your job, with trying to get a new job, if this has really concerned you in the last few years, please indicate with a capital W for woman and Y for yes. And if not, W, capital W and N for no. And similarly, if you are a man on this call, and we welcome you because we can do this together, please indicate by MY, man, yes, or MN, man, no. And I see, Linda, you've popped up again. What do you got to tell us?
Am I audible?
Now you are.
Okay, perfect. You hit the nail on the mark there by explaining what the MY and N and etc. were, because there was a question on the comments on that. And as far as the poll is still continuing to receive some votes, but we are receiving a majority, 60% at the moment, with WY, which means woman yes, that they are concerned with job precariousness. So we'll see the voting continues, the voting trend continues with 62.5% for MW. So with that, Denise, I'll give the final poll results in a second, but maybe you can continue the discussion.
What's really interesting about that high percentage is that about job precariousness, as you'll see, are some of the reasons why why women do feel this job precariousness, regardless of where you are in the world. It may be for very many different reasons, and I do try to present some of the reasons as to what those things are. So we will continue. So in this diagram, which is really quite simple, we can see that with the changed organizational logic, with the way that the organizations are changing and having to change, and even in the discussion on the panel this morning, it was interesting to see this clash between, well, we have to change, we're trying to change, but we're moving away from the pandemic, and can we not go back to where we might have been, even though we want to support diversity, equity, and inclusion? It's really an interesting dilemma, I think, that a lot of companies are finding themselves in. So with this changed organisational logic over the past 30 years, particularly with the impact of the pandemic and post the pandemic, the diagram looks at job precarity, a world which is demanding flexibility, and aligned to this is the waning of the traditional employment relationship, which particularly impacts women. If we move in a clockwise direction, we see this in action with the increasing number of policies addressing gender equality and work-life balance policies. We also have, an increased amount of diversity discourse and implementation of, numerous diversity programs. Yet what is constantly being agreed, even in research that's being done on this. And even if you speak to professionals in the field, if you speak to HR departments, if you speak to leaders, you'll hear them say there's a real disparity, a keen disparity between policies and practice, because it is more difficult to affect this legislation and organisational strategy in practice. And so I know in the research that I've done, there is a tremendous discrepancy between the policy and the practice, between the intent and the outcome. And a lot of this is because we have a reliance on language which tells us to look for opportunities as opposed to determining how we're going to achieve outcomes. And that's a very important piece when you're doing any form of strategy. You can certainly look for opportunities, but you do have to look for outcomes. So this disparity between the policy and the practice actually enables supervisors and managers, and in the arena of the energy industry, we really do know that it's about discretionary bias, which defeats the purpose of the intent of policies, of discourse, of programs. And this is shown in the next box in the diagram, where decisions relating to the exercise of entitlements by employees are actually made really close to the employee by their immediate supervisors and by their managers. So for women, what this means is that we're relying on discretion and decision-making often by male supervisors and managers without a suitable a number of female leaders in the business. We, especially in energy, we find it's making it harder and harder for us to actually move beyond that discretion. Additionally, there is some criticism of policies which, while promoting gender equality, are also about addressing employment rates and economic growth. So, there's supposed to be a focus on gender equality, but yet in reality, they're also addressing and perhaps paying more attention to employment rates and economic growth. So the effect for women and other minority groups is therefore severely diluted or derailed by other agendas. So, we women have to stop just looking at the fact, our company's doing diversity training, or our company's got this great program. What we really need to understand is, are these agendas really, these other agendas taking over the value of women? So studies have also shown that in the white collar and professional cohort, the atmosphere is characterized by perceived, if not actual, growing uncertainty. And if we perhaps look at the poll number 2, where Linda expressed that it was moving up, to 62% for job precariousness by women, realize is that in actual fact, we have this growing uncertainty, and I think that that's what that 62% reflected. So let's take a closer look at the specific impact of this for women in energy. So, this is a very full slide, and there are 5 contributing factors to precarity for women. For the sake of time, I will be selective. So the first is corporate downsizing. And I'm going to pick on, because, I think motherhood penalty is well known, but really the other 2 kind of go hand in hand. The second one really talks to that discretionary opportunity that occurs between policy and practice. So the employer, a principle of job deserving is a really interesting one. And it's where employers may decide that white women and men and women of colour, older workers, are less deserving than young white men of keeping their jobs. So here's this job deserving, this discretionary ability. Now, some people might say, well, in my part of the world, it's not really about white men. Well, it's about elite. It's about being elite. So whoever is elite in your world, in your culture, is really an important perspective, I think, to have. And so, of course, the aforementioned diverse groups face heightened job insecurities. We have a question here that's just come in. Linda, would you like to share it with me? Yeah.
Of course, I'll read it for you, Denise. So it says, first of all, it's a nice comment for you. Great workshop, Denise. I have a burning question whether the topic of women in workplace is brought up. Opinionated women at the workplace sometimes tend to be labeled all too aggressive. How can we bring our authentic self to work and avoid these labels?
Look, I think that's an excellent question, and I know that many of you would probably be surprised that I might have been one of those very opinionated women. I think that's a loaded question, and it's hard to kind of reply to that within the space of a minute or so. But I think that it is about the language we use, and sometimes we have to be smart or smarter about how we drive what it is that we're demanding or what it is that we're asking. Now, I absolutely accept that we're often, strong women are often accused of being assertive, and we kind of prefer that to being called aggressive. But I think that what we need to really be discussing is why are they saying that? Is it, let's get to, if someone was to say to me, look, you're being very aggressive about this, I'd say, listen, let's just not talk about what appears that you think is going on here. Because what I'm trying to understand, and it's perhaps my enthusiasm, perhaps my passion, is more around how does what I'm suggesting not fit with your view of the world? Let's have a discussion about that. Linda, you're obviously burning to say something.
I am, Denise. I want to add to your discussion, and I want to say that a lot of times it's not so much that how we as women can change our authentic self. It's really more in looking for allies. So, for example, if you know that you're going to have a discussion where there could be some perceived differences of opinion, or not perceived, but actual differences of opinion, etc., or if it's something that is going to be of a sensitive nature that some people are going to be receiving that as something of an attack or anything like that, you could potentially look for some male allies before that meeting takes place or before that discussion takes place in a public forum, and just go to some of your colleagues and say, listen, this is the rationale as to why I believe X, Y, and Z is really what needs to happen here. Can I count on your support during the meeting if there should be some pushback, etc. So I think that there are ways that we can continue to be our authentic self, but at the same time, make sure that we are going to be supported.
Absolutely. I think you raise a really valid point. I would also add that we need to change the way that we deal with this. And I think sometimes what also has come into this argument or this discussion has been the fact that organizations, and I talk about this further on, they censure dissent. So often women have learned, and this is the question that you're really asking, we've learned to remove ourselves from those scenarios which are going to cause dissent. And often people who support women who are strong, women are kind of pushed to the side. And also what happens is that often women who sometimes get to the top or get into more senior places are actually people who often don't support other women. And so we're really dealing with quite a dilemma in the workplace. So I do think it's about being authentic. I think it's not about holding a standard and saying, well, this is me and you just have to bear it. I think it's not about, as Linda said very rightly, changing who you are, but it's about learning how to better navigate and how to better strategize over what really does work. I mean, I often, when I was in previous roles, would get really, really annoyed with how long things would take. And I then started to learn that I needed to not adjust my thinking or my expectations, but really to focus in on, who were supporters. And men do this, men use this. It's not to say that they don't get angry, etc. And bad behavior by men is just as bad as bad behavior by women. It's just bad behavior. So I know we haven't necessarily answered your question, but the main thing is, as Linda said, is this is not to achieve change. It's not about changing us. It's about the workplace and the language of the workplace and the policies and the programs and the structures and the systems. That makes it really huge. But what it does, it gives us something to work towards. Okay, so if we now, we look at the one of the next boxes, and we look at underrepresentation. What this really talks about, as you can see, there is strong social closure mechanisms. And this is an interesting group of words because it's actually a sociological phrase representing where access to participation in a social group, such as an organization, is limited due to certain criteria that either allow people to become members or exclude them from membership. Could be gender, race, age, etc. And so there is underrepresentation. And, I always think of the need in organizations to have so much better and improved selection processes. And I think very often we really need to think about the fact that this underrepresentation is typically across the industry, across the energy industry, is that 20% population tends to be women per the McKinsey report, but only 12% are technical. And that brings us into another discussion, which we're going to have shortly when we look at STEM. So then there's also the question of cyclical layoffs. While women and men are impacted by these institutionalized layoffs, and that's how it's often described in oil and gas industry, women have borne the brunt of their impacts. And, I get really annoyed when I see, the energy industry saying that in the energy transition we don't have enough women, or we don't have enough talent. And my comment is, well, have a look at all those people, including many, many women who have been laid off, but who have also chosen because of that not to participate in oil and gas or even energy because of the way that they've been treated. So that becomes a systemic and structural issue which we really need to think about. And then we have the next one, which is reproduction of male domination. Those who advocate for women tend to fall by the wayside, and that's something that I mentioned just a few minutes ago. And sometimes senior women who are selected for leadership posts are themselves hostile to women. So what we have is this reproduction of male domination, and it really has an effect on precarity for women in the energy industry, because it suggests a way of behaving which is not the authentic self. And then if we look at the final one, which is STEM, we see that women leave STEM occupations more often than men do, and that women in STEM typically reach middle management, then leave their jobs and the sector altogether. Again, this is a structural issue. We have more than enough STEM people, especially STEM women, but they can't seem to break that middle management barrier. And once again, we're looking at that whole female educational advantage, which isn't serving us well. So let's also look at some good news. In the Catalyst report, it actually shows that 32% of the global workforce of women is engaged in the renewable industry, energy industry, and 45% of those are in administrative roles as women, and 28% in STEM-related roles, which is quite a bit higher, but still not good enough to where women need to be in terms of STEM. So let's have a different look at what contributes to job precarity for women as identified in PwC's 2022 Global Workforce Hopes and Fears Survey. We even had this in the discussion this morning, and I made the comment that the fact that we have to have a hopes and fears survey is really quite sad. It really suggests that somewhere in the workplace we're really not doing the right thing. And we can link this slide back to the earlier slide where I spoke to the Great Resignation and the no time for complacency. And, you know, where women are less likely to, for women, such as feeling less satisfied with their pay, asking for a raise or a promotion. They're less likely to feel listened to by their managers. And this needs to be linked to the issue of job precariousness. So even our studies are presenting this type of information. So let's now, lost my place. So let's now turn to the rise of interdisciplinary teams and career maps, which I have listed under the heading Status of Hierarchical Conventions, which all sounds very formal, but it's actually really quite simple to understand. So in speaking to the rise of interdisciplinary teams over the course of the last 2 years of the new economy and in the post-pandemic era with remote teams, and also discussing career maps instead of the traditional career ladders, the traditional hierarchical conventions of organizations are being diluted, if not disappearing. So in other words, the convention of organizations has always been hierarchical, and often because you know, in ages gone by, the use of military to invade set up hierarchical conventions, and this has been transferred across patriarchy and androcentricity, you know, where the world is built around the male environment, and so that hierarchy continues to exist. So what does this mean for women who haven't been well served by the traditional hierarchical conventions? Can we correctly assume that these new non-hierarchical conventions, such as more teamwork and individualized career management, be automatically favourable to women, or are they in fact the wolf lurking under sheep's clothing? So let's take a look at the rise of interdisciplinary teams. The diagram is pretty straightforward, and I'm really going to go through it pretty quickly. Hierarchical convention of organisations, which it relies on managers and workers to carry out tasks specified in their job descriptions, where they're evaluated by managers, etc. And it moves over time to the new economy, where it's flatter. We have teams, we have a project-driven organisation. And so this shouldn't be anything new to anyone. It's been occurring for quite some time now, but even pushed forward even more significantly by the pandemic. So over the course of the period I've nicknamed the era of the great inverted commas, we see that management layers are shed, and the interdisciplinary teams, and for some we'll just call it greater teamwork, even though it can mean teams being people moving between teams, different teams working together, etc. And I even one of our board members was talking to me the other day, and she mentioned that in her workplace they don't have teams of people working for them. They have a pool of people, and depending on the project, they just pick and remove. So this is the work process of the day, where membership is fluid, teams assemble, expand, disband, and people can work with considerable discretion, particularly if they're working from home, because that's something that we still haven't worked out yet, is how this remoteness is going to work, where there is collaboration rather than independent work, often typified as a woman's preference, for collaboration. And results can often be peer assessed. So is this woman favourable or gender neutral? So with women working in teams where it is likely they are in the minority due to low female population, as we know in oil and gas, where women are indicating they are feeling excluded as per the PwC report, and with hybrid and remote work options, and where the likelihood of a male supervisor and his potential for discretionary bias will be higher, can it be argued that women are to benefit from this work process change? And this is something that we really need to look and watch for when we try to understand the dynamics of what's going on in these teams. And then what of an even playing field, even in the leadership of teams? In a study in 2012, the role of gender in student perceptions of leadership on interdisciplinary engineering teams, it was revealed that for male students in this study, leading was more about directing teamwork, running meetings, and project oversight. Sounds familiar? And for female students, leading was about facilitating collaboration among team members, about being responsible, accountable, and contributing to the team. So while this speaks to leadership within teams, the issues of gender differences in teamwork are apparent, and a not so positive impact on women is demonstrable. I think that what we can do now is look at career maps and ideals. One thing that I'm just going to mention is that this is going to move fairly quickly, and I know Linda is actually going to say to me, "Oh, Denise, we might have to exclude a poll. Oh, Denise, we might have to hurry it up." I actually think we're doing okay. All right. So can we just play it by ear? Is that what you were going to say to me, Linda?
Yes, you are, amongst other things, you're a mind reader, Denise. Yes, we are running a little behind. We're going to skip a poll or two. And I wanted to say that the third poll is already uploaded and some of the results are coming in. But go ahead and continue, and then we'll get to your poll slide number 3, and then we'll go over the results.
Okay, fantastic. So in the traditional context, career ladders are standardized, so some would even say institutionalized. and where demarcated rungs lead to higher higher paying roles or more responsible positions, and often represent for a lot of people career success. And yet in the new era of career maps and ideals, in which individualized programs of career development are crafted and customized actually by employees and negotiated by them with their supervisors. In other words, they do deals about their career with their managers. So when individually negotiated, the potential for supervisors' bias is quite high, and it can go unchecked. Remember the difference between the policies and the practice in action. Again, the question can be asked, are career maps any more gender neutral or woman favourable than the standardised career ladders of previous career development? So we really need to think this through and not just accept because it sounds like it's individualised, oh, that's better for me. Let's again think back to PwC's 2022 Global Workforce Hopes and Fears survey of the women are less likely to scenarios. Will women be more likely to generate aspirational career maps and negotiate ideals with their managers when they feel less able to approach their managers, as the study told us? And they're more excluded, as the study told us. And they expect their managers more likely, can they expect their managers more likely to support them? So before we dig deeper, you guessed it, another poll. The question is, would you consider on the face of it that the rise of these interdisciplinary teams and career maps and ideals that we've just discussed very briefly, do you think they're gender neutral and perhaps women favourable over traditional organisational conventions? Just jot that down as you have done previously with yes, no, or unsure. Great. So we'll keep moving on immediately and dig a little deeper with some additional information which might help you answer this question more definitively. Well, actually, Linda's back.
Yes, I am. So yes, the poll results right now show that about 50% of the participants believe that there is no benefit to women with regards to this. So yeah, and actually it's a very live poll results. It is now at 53.8% with no, 23% with unsure. So Denise, back to you. Denise, apologies, you are on mute accidentally.
My husband would like to have that sometimes, that he could just put me on mute. Anyway, I probably shouldn't say that in this kind of environment. And if he's listening, love you. So let's have a look at this next chart. And this will only take really a couple of minutes because it's just to give you an understanding of where this information comes from and how our thinking has been shaped. So what sits behind how our workplace, societies, groups are constructed is really critical. So too often we don't understand the impact of these forces on what has happened, and why in the workplace. And so we think we can change things, we can argue over things, but these things are entrenched and we need to understand them so we know how to best deal with them. So understanding, for example, the dominant definition of science as an ideology of gender and race helps us to explain how the male, typically white or elite, dominates the scientific enterprise, as in an oil and gas company. And it shows, this ideology shows how this is built and reinforced over time. On the left side of the chart are the characteristics that describe popular stereotypes about these elite or white men. And this is all really well researched by the social theorist Patricia Hill Collins in 1999. So really not that long ago. And on the right side are the non-scientific characteristics, which are viewed negatively within an organization, a scientific or a science organization that we can, place oil and gas into. And these things stereotype women and men of color, or the non-elite. And so it makes them underrepresented in science. And there's a whole swathe of research on this. And in associated workplaces, such as oil and gas. So we can see how this dynamic, if you just look at some of the differences in some of the words or the preferences in style and behavior, we start to realize that this is really informed to make our workplaces gendered. So when we start to look at gendered organizations and gender and sector, an industry sector which is gendered, we start to realize that it's important to realize that there's a lot of research over many years that points to how jobs, how hierarchies and careers in the traditional logic, particularly in sectors such as oil and gas, are considered to be gendered. That is male favourable, built around males, the language of males. And yet we as women have attempted to operate, survive, and even thrive in these gendered organisations and sectors. Many of us have failed to realise what is or was at play in the traditional organisational logic that we were actually entering into. So when you have a look, in the past, women, that central pale pink square, women have acceded to what they found themselves with. And with the new organisational logic, will we challenge some of this thinking, some of the new thinking that suggests that it's, better for women, or will we accede? So do we have to accept this at face value? Knowledge and understanding is really key to moving the needle. So when asked in poll 3 about the gender neutral or women favourable aspect of teamwork and career maps, the result was, as we discussed. I wonder if your responses would have been a little different if we'd asked it after these last 2 slides, and this is only touching the surface. So our final topic is networking, and which has grown in importance in discussions with women. So what we're going to do here is, once again, look at networking, but through your eyes, and very simply, that do you use networking in and out of your workplace as an intentional action to support your career advancement? Intentional is the key word here, both in and out. We'll discuss your responses, and we'll only be talking about this briefly, but it's a critical piece of the puzzle, as well as being an important one. So let's have a look. I think we should be moving our slides forward. I think we've talked through these ones, ladies. So what I'll talk to you about now is that Line has discussed this topic on a number of occasions in the last 18 months, and we will be conducting 2 dedicated workshops by an external facilitator before the end of the year on this specific topic. So please look out for it if you're interested. The workshop comes from a dedicated women's program specifically designed for women and informed by Line's work in this area. So let's understand networking in the context of this discussion. So really simple, networking has become the chief way that workers gain exposure and locate job opportunities. Typically, the networks of white or elite men are both more powerful and extensive than those of any other group. Race and gender shape the experience of network ties, and women don't get this. Even in a weak network, ties benefit. Even in a weak network, the ties benefit white or elite men in their careers. White women and people of colour usually require powerful sponsors, as we know, in top positions to promote them into higher paying jobs. and leadership roles. Yet for many women in oil and gas, there are insufficient women in sponsorship roles in their organizations to provide this female allyship, and they need to develop male allyships instead of seeking mentoring opportunities or seek mentoring opportunities, I should say, outside their organizations. So we have this internal and external scenario that women need to actively think about. And this is not just about going for a coffee. It can be, but it's a much more intentional aspect that we really need to consider. So for transitioning jobs internally, networks are critical for identifying opportunities for career advancement through an individual's network or personal relationships. And in oil and gas, for women, think about this may be limited or depleted through the cyclical layoffs. So there's no use going to your network when your network has been devastated by layoffs as well. So the principal means of learning about job openings outside an organization is through professional associations and networks. And so once again, whether internal or external, a lot of these networks for women have been destroyed. So it's hard to network successfully, either internally or externally, when a large number of your network has also been laid off. But networking is not only about building relationships. And so while I don't necessarily agree with many self-help books that explain how women need to improve themselves for success, given the dynamics at play that we've already covered, such as the gendering of jobs and careers, there are truths about networking and relationships that can be applied here. It is acknowledged that women are very, very good at building relationships initially, but are often so busy, I should say, being good at their job and wanting to be recognized for their current competency that they fail to focus on their career. Leveraging relationships through networking is a mechanism to build successful career outcomes, and it's not something that women are really, really comfortable with because it's an external action. It's external to your job and is deliberate and intentional. Networking assists women to understand and act on their potential rather than enhance their current level of job responsibility. So the relationship conundrum for women is effectively the antagonism between building relationships and leveraging them to create the networks needed for career success. At this point, I'd like you to complete the final poll. So in line with the material presented here today, some researchers argue that the three of the four elements that we've discussed, the institution of teamwork, the career maps, and the networking, favour men and qualities associated with masculinity. Do you agree with this? Yes or no? And so please answer in the chat. So this is our final poll, acting as your assessment to the workshop's ideas. If you can complete that, we've basically worked our way through, and we're just going to summarise now, which gives us a good 8 minutes before we finish today. So let's have a look at our summary, and really this diagram sums it up in a nutshell. And I can feel a very long but meaningful sentence coming on. And I suspect that that's going to be interrupted by Linda.
I'm sorry, Denise.
That's okay.
I somewhat have a control when I can come in and cannot come into the stage. But I do want to say that I want you to finish your line of thought in presentation, as well as to let you know that we do have 2 Q&A questions that I'd like to share with you whenever you're ready.
Yep, let's do it now.
All right. So one question is, career ladders always haven't been honored by companies for women. Why should we think this model works?
I think that's an excellent question, and you're so right. Because I think sometimes we've bought into the rhetoric. We've bought into how people think about these career ladders, and not many of us. We dutifully, write out our career aspirations and where we want to go and do all of that. But very few of us will actually say, whether it's to our manager or to our HR, in a way that really counts, I don't believe in this because I don't think it's actually going to get me anywhere. And I think that's part of that voice that women have to adopt, that that says no, or I don't agree, and start a conversation that says, where someone says, you know what, if you don't think that this is going to work for you, what would work for you? Now we have a conversation. And I think that's really important, because I tell you what, when I was working in HR OD, I was more of an OD person than an HR person, thank God, because that would have been terrible for the people concerned. They actually, if someone had come to me and said that, I would have really listened, because that's a person who is really wanting to do well in their job. So I think that there are ways. I take the sentiment and I agree, and I know that was probably a reaction to the way that I had phrased it. But I think it was more around the fact that we've tended to go along, and now we need to change that.
Great, thank you, Denise.
Second question?
Yes, the second question is, once again, thanks for the great session, Denise. I'm wondering how we can more meaningfully move these conversations out of our own echo chambers and into the workplace, especially in places where the hierarchy is super strict. So many people might agree with these things, but the second a leader shuts them down, that's the end. There's no challenging the hierarchy, and frankly, those are usually the people who might need to be challenged. Would love your thoughts.
Look, I know, and there's a lot of risk in doing what I'm suggesting, but it's a little bit like the 60s when women burnt their bras and took them off and waved them around. It was en masse, and I think it's about time women regained that voice. And I know that even at Lean in Energy, Linda, you're an integral part of this. We're changing our voice in terms of things that we're daring to say. And I think you would agree, it's been quite interesting that as of yet, we haven't had any negativity. In fact, we are getting a lot of support from a lot of people, men and women alike. But I think it's because of the visibility, it's the ability for us to take risk, but also to gather women. And I like that phrase, outside of our own echo chambers. If enough of us are saying these things, then I think we need to see the value that is going to be brought out of that. Probably not necessarily the best answer I could have given, but I certainly like that, and I'd like a bit more time to think about it as well. But it's a good question, very good question.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so we're going to move pretty quickly. So as I said, I can feel a very long but meaningful sentence coming on. So hang on to your seats and see if you can follow me. Any organisation or industry sector in this discussion, oil and gas, which is male-dominated and where censure is applied to dissent, exactly what we were just talking about, that in the new organisational logic is deploying interdisciplinary teams, individualised career maps, and where career advantage advancement is promoted by networking, but is unavailable to some genders, such as women or diverse groups, because of lack of sufficient population at all levels, as in women, but especially in the executive leadership ranks. If you can't see it, you can't be it. You don't have a voice sitting at the table. And because social closure mechanisms are operating, and we talked about that, and where job precariousness has become institutionalized through layoffs, downsizing, and externalizing of risk, women need to challenge the norms and beware of the appearance of gender neutrality, greater flexibility, and more compatibility with women's non-linear career trajectory. That's from the quote that we had at the very beginning. As just the wolf in sheep's clothing. We really need to indicate that we're not just accepting these things at face value, and that's a really critical piece of it. And so that's where I'm going to have to leave it. I do think that last slide helps to pull it all together, because I think it's a big topic. But I think we have to start somewhere, and we have to, educate ourselves in terms of what is truly meaningful and what will make a difference. So here's the final reflection, and I'm going to read it. The new economy is pro-diversity, but remains deeply structured by gender and other forms of inequality. The culture of insecurity, the expansion of precarious employment, the changed structure of jobs, and the new discourse of diversity contribute to male domination and the economic oppression of women. Now, that's a quotation and a half to remember. It should make you want to think about it and make you want to do something about it. And so now a final question before you leave or stay. Please note to my production team, I've done pretty well with a pretty heavy-duty topic, and I hope you appreciate that. So before you leave or stay around for the virtual networking session over the next 15 minutes, it's where we can have virtual chats. What I'd like you to do is to final response, the principle of one. What is one thing that you are taking away with you today that you will use, reflect on, research, change your thinking on, or and I'd like you to write it in the chat before you leave. This is really important. There's no use lean in energy doing this work if people won't give us some ideas and some help as to how this type of information works, how this is going to change, and how it's going to challenge, and how we can collaborate. So I really would like that. So before you start writing your note in the chat, thank you for attending, and I trust you've really enjoyed the session and found it challenging, interesting, and useful. We look forward to seeing your responses to the final question asked here. If you've seen any of the things that we put on our social media, you'll know that we will probably make comment on this, and you might see some interesting things come out of some of the polls, etc. Another slide will come up shortly with details on LEWAS and Lean, and we look forward to meeting you should you decide to stay in the networking opportunity commencing now. Finally, if you're interested in any of the reference materials used in developing this workshop, please request it. So if we can just go to the last slide, here's details of how to contact us, the LEWAS Awards 2022. And I'll leave it there. So thank you for your attention. I tried to get you out of here on time, but please, we've got another 14 or 15 minutes or so if you want to take on networking. And I'll be around, and I'm sure Linda will too. So thank you, everyone, and pleasure meeting you. And I hope you have a good evening, good day, good morning, whatever it might be. Thank you. Bye-bye. Linda?
Yes, thank you. So I just want to make sure that I go over the last poll results with you. With regards to the question about some researchers argue that institution of teamwork, career maps, and network favor men and qualities associated with masculinity. And the audience agreed by 72%.
Okay, not laughing out of joy, just laughing because, okay.
So I take it that you were not surprised by the poll results.
No.
Okay.
Okay, so fantastic. Thanks, Linda, for your help. I know it's a heavy-duty task. So if you're staying around, I'm staying around for the to chat with people. Hope to do that. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.